Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Robin, and I help direct events here at the Strand. For a little bit of history, Strand was founded in 1927 by the Bass family over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until, after over 92 years, Strand is the sole survivor, still run by the Bass family, running 400 events a year, and still housing new and used books. Tonight, I'm excited to have with us Suzanne McConnell, author, editor, and writing teacher, to discuss Pity the Reader. Suzanne was a student of Kurt Vonnegut at the Iowa Writers' Workshop during its heyday, the period from 1965 to 67, when Vonnegut, along with Nelson Algren and other notable authors, was... No, wrong date. Please correct me. What is it? I said 50. My sheet says 65, so I just said the wrong number. I'm very sorry. I can start over. Are you sure? Good evening, everybody. Okay. From 1965 to 67, when Vonnegut, along with... Okay, I'll just go back to where I was. Was in residence and was finishing his masterpiece, Slaughterhouse-Five. Okay. Vonnegut and McConnell became friends and stayed so for many years. Suzanne's works have been published in the Huffington Post, Bellevue Literary Review, and Poets and Writers. She has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize twice, as well as won first place in fiction contests for the New Ohio Review, Prime Number magazine, and So to Speak. Here to discuss her work is award-winning author, editor, and fellow Vonnegut expert, Ginger Strand. Ginger's writings have been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Harper's, Tin House, and others. Strand is the author of The Brothers Vonnegut, Science and Fiction in the House of Magic. Moderating is Dan Simon, founder of Seven Stories Press, and Chevalier of Arts and Letters by order of the French Ministry of Culture. Dan was Vonnegut's final editor. He has also worked with Octavia Butler, Noam Chomsky, and Barry Gifford, among others. Simon's works have been published in The Nation, The Progressive, and other places. Please join me in welcoming Suzanne, Ginger, and Dan to the Strand.
So... yeah, Kurt was, no, better. Okay, I have to kiss the mic. Okay, yeah, Kurt was kind to his editors. He was fortunate in his editors, and after Timequake in '97, and Susan Peterson, his last editor at Putnam, died. I had the good fortune of being his editor for the rest of his life, and then a bit posthumously. Kurt was fond of the expression hostages to fortune. In other words, the helpless passengers that we bring on the ride of our lives that are kidnapped by us in a sense, since children don't get to choose their parents. But a writer's legacy is also a collection of hostages to fortune after the writer dies and is no longer able to protect them in any way. So, you know, what often happens afterward depends on friends, fellow writers, and it determines a lot what is, you know, how the legacy survives, if the legacy survives. It's not a foregone conclusion. And Kurt's legacy since his death in 2007 has been something of a bumpy ride. He was unfortunate in his biographer, Charles Shields, who really didn't have a good sense of Kurt or his worldview, who fell out with the estate, was denied the right to quote him, which made him even less friendly towards Kurt, and it was really unfortunate. And in fact, you know, some of the scholarship that has followed Kurt's death, it just hasn't been worthy of the work. So, you know, I felt sometimes like, you know, like I'm watching a horse race, and I really, you know, my heart's with the wrong horse, and the horse stumbles, and I'm out of luck. But then Kurt's luck started to change with a guy named Dan Wakefield. and Dan, who was a protege of Kurt's, his publisher at the time, Seymour Lawrence, put them together and wanted Kurt to encourage Dan, and they're both from Indianapolis. And so Dan, after Kurt died, he did the letters, which Random House published, and he did a fantastic job. And then for us, he did the collection of speeches to young people, If This Isn't Nice, What Is, and again did a fabulous job. And then 2 years ago, we did collected stories with Dan and Jerry, and again, this guy's 80-something years old now, and he delivered a manuscript that, I don't know, it was 1,500 pages. I don't know how they carried the manuscript to the post office, but they did, you know, and it was a great act of love, and you know, so Kurt was starting to get lucky. And then someone we didn't publish, Ginger Strand, came along with her book, The Brothers Vonnegut, which, if you get a chance, I know there are some copies here tonight. It's a wonderful book that tells two stories. One is Kurt's older brother Bernard's life as a scientist trying to control the weather, which he actually had a lot of success doing, seeding clouds. This was his lifelong obsession. And then Kurt's start as a story writer, which is what allowed him to quit his job that actually Bernard had helped him get at GE in the publicity department. And these two lives were intertwined for the, you know, really the 10, 15 years from the beginning of World War II to the early 1950s that is the heart of Ginger's book. And the two stories intertwine in startling ways. And I love this book because she lingers on Kurt's early failures. And these failures continued, and I don't know how he persevered, or I do have a clue how, and it'll come up. But, you know, by really not glossing over the failures, you kind of understand the magnitude of Kurt's eventual triumph creatively. And then finally, the book that we're celebrating the launch of today, Suzanne's book, Pity the Reader, which tells a whole nother side of Kurt. Kurt is a teacher of writing and of somebody who really believed in the craft of writing as an expression of humanity. And you know, this book started, it was foisted on Suzanne, actually. The estate wanted to do it. They asked Dan. He said, Suzanne will do it. And so, you know, this project kind of landed on her. And then, you know, she and I started working together, and I'm a very difficult editor to deal with. She had to deal with me. But, you know, I admire Suzanne so much because she started with this really enormous project, because Kurt did, throughout his life, talk about writing and write about writing and said very interesting things. And the estate had said to her, use anything you want. You know, the opposite of the Charles Shields story, where they said you can't use anything. To his biographer, to Suzanne, they said use anything they want. And she spent years really finding everything there was. And the thing you learn as a writer is the more material you have, the harder it gets. It doesn't make the job easier, it makes the job harder. And so she had to organize this material into some kind of a story and chapters, and she did it really brilliantly. And I have tremendous respect and admiration, and it is a new side of Kurt. And I think it's the most intimate portrait of Kurt. Even in A Man Without a Country, which I worked on with Kurt, which is the closest thing to an autobiography that he published, there's still a formality and a distance. And that comes away in Suzanne's book. It really is a wonderful book. So we're very fortunate here to be with Suzanne and Ginger. And I have questions. They suggested questions to me which I ignored. So I have questions which they don't know, and they don't know what's coming. So the first question to both of you is if you could share with us some of what or something that you learned about Kurt as a human being and as a writer that you don't think people know about him.
Read my book.
What comes to mind? Okay.
That's a large question.
You can give it a small answer.
help me out.
No, you're on your own.
An old classmate is here, who I quote in the book, actually, Bob Lehrman. I'm sorry, I really can't think of something.
Ginger, we can come back to it. Ginger?
I think that what came out when I was working on the book most for me was how central morality was to Kurt as a person, how hard he thought about issues of justice and the importance of social justice nonstop. And I think that, you know, the superficial take when you look at his books is, oh, he's comic, he's funny, but in fact, everything is deeply, deeply moral. And that moral sense was a real Vonnegut trait. It was part of his brother Bernard's makeup as well. So that was surprising, or maybe not so surprising, but I think a place where you push beyond the superficial view of Kurt and see something different.
I have a hard time because he was my teacher. I read, when I got there, I didn't know who he was. And people at the workshop gravitated towards, it was really interesting. People eventually, after a semester or two, gravitated toward the teacher that they related to somehow. And he was, can I read a passage?
Sure.
Okay. Much better than talking. If I can find my glasses. Really close? Okay. Okay, I'll try to kiss this mic. I have to get my glasses out. Ugh. Can you help me? My glasses are here somewhere. Okay. Have to find it. I'm much more entertaining on the page, I believe.
All writers are. We're all better. We're all better on the page, or we would be something else.
Except maybe Kurt. He was pretty good. Okay. This is a chapter that's called "The Mother of All Pearls." Can you hear me now? Okay. I'm really giving you the nut of the book for me, or of the craft, or him. Picture a huge luminescent pearl. Its gleam so great that its glow prevails over all the lesser pearls nestled around it. Well, here is the mother of all pearls of wisdom that Kurt offered us at Iowa on the nuts and bolts of writing fiction, or at least me. You're in the entertainment business. He stood in front of the class, shaking his head over someone's story as he said that many times. This was startling to hear. Entertainment business implied Hollywood with its crass glitter and flash. I myself wasn't thinking about entertaining anyone. I just wanted to get sorrow and outrage off my chest. Everyone in the workshop had things to get off their chests. Our instructors did too. It seemed that Kurt had the most. He was writing Slaughterhouse-5. We knew his firebombing prisoner of war backstory. These were soul-scouring experiences, and we were in the entertainment business? Eventually, I understood he meant this. You have to play by the rules of the game of fiction well enough so that you can get across what is in the rag and bone shop of your heart. You have to be like a magician or pickpocket, distracting the audience by entertaining while you are really saying those things you most want to say. At a party recently, I told 2 MFA candidates that this was Kurt's most important advice. They stared at me, aghast. One of the hardest lessons for novice writers to realize is that caring alone, no matter what you've been through or what story you have to tell, doesn't matter in terms of rendering the successful creation of your work. It's not your story that matters. It's how you tell it. Vonnegut knew the distinction between spinning a yarn and the voltage that caused the yarn to spin, between the self and the persona. Of all he taught about writing, what he said about the entertainment business, I would come to discover, was the most complex and important. And then I just want to read one more passage here. Nope, It's not in the right spot. Okay, that's probably enough.
Did anyone happen to see where I put my glasses? I think I can manage. I think I can figure it out. No, I don't think so. None of you saw. None of you. I think it's okay. So, okay, the next question is for Suzanne, which is just, can you talk a little bit about the journey of writing this book? You know, I know that it truly was a journey, and that, as I mentioned before, just your ability to, you know, you kind of started at the beginning, but you didn't stop till you got to the end, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your process.
Ginger and I had a conversation about both of our processes, and they were very different, so I think it would be interesting to hear both of us talk about them. But mine was, I did start with Dan Wakefield calling me up. You know when somebody calls you up and they say, I have a great opportunity for you? And you wait for the next thing. So, yeah, so his great opportunity was his great escape, because he was completely exhausted from doing the letters book. And he told me, this is in my book, actually. It's in the introduction, so I'm not telling you anything new. But he said, you're the perfect person for this because you're a teacher and you're a writer and you knew him. And I thought, yes, that's true. I am. I'm the perfect person for this. And it came at the perfect time for me. It came at a, which I won't just go into right now, but it really came at the perfect time. So I started by reading everything. And I got the cheapest. I was given access to his books. The Vonnegut Trust gave me access to his books. And what I was told was I had to, 65% of it had to be his words. So that was quite a wonderful but difficult thing to do. So I hadn't done a research paper since I was in undergraduate school, probably. I didn't do it at the writer's workshop, you know. So I brought an example. This is my old cat's cradle from 1971, I believe. See all these sticky notes? I marked these books up entirely. Every time I saw something that was an example or an anecdote or something that I thought would fit. But I also relied, first of all, on there are endnotes in this book. If you have a book, you can see the front and the back cover. It's 2 pages that were in the New York Times, and it's a very concise how to write with style. And I saw that in the New York Times when I was teaching at Hunter. One of my ex-students is sitting right there. He's now my meditation instructor. Time goes by. Anyway, I handed it out every semester because it's such good basic advice, not about writing fiction, but about writing anything. So I used that as my outline for the first chapter. And I kind of used it as a focus for the next, because his first piece of advice is about caring about something. So my first chapter on fiction it's called The Prime Mover, and it's about caring about something. And then there's a lot of dangers in caring about something, as I had experienced, because you can fail, you can get very hung up on it. So I sort of followed my own. I followed my own, but I began to follow his life, because he cared passionately about many things. But one thing that he cared about from the beginning was his experience from World War II. So I used that. And then I originally had divided up into big sections. It's now not divided up. My editor banished the divisions, but they were things like I forgot when I talked to you.
Kind of like one thing led to the next.
Yeah, well, it was like okay. I brought my outline because I couldn't remember it, and I knew I was going to talk about this, and I wouldn't remember it again. The prime mover, then the section, the worth of writing to the South, the worth of writing to society, tools of the trade, approaches, tools of the trade, nuts and bolts. And then I had a big section at the end, how to live as a writer, which is a kind of story in itself because, you know, if you read his work, there's just a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff. And people need to know how to live as an artist. They don't. I know that. So here's where my own teaching came in. Because I've taught for years. I've taught at many different things. The longest at Hunter, but I've really taught a lot of different places and people. And, you know, kids don't know. They think that you become a movie star. They think the weirdest things. And so, you know, I put a lot of stuff in that. So anyway, I just began doing this outline of a large outline, throwing everything in there. And then I hired someone to, is she here? Charity, are you here? She said she was coming, okay. Okay, sorry. I hired somebody to transfer all these sticky note categories that I had digitally and put them in and line them up. So that was how I began the process. And then I have to say one other thing about my process, which is I have a writing group that I've had for years. And some of them are here, and they were my support, my cheerleading, my no, don't, that's too much, or that's not enough. So I had this ongoing wonderful support from the beginning. Yeah.
Ginger. So we talked a little bit about failure. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. I do love how you cover failure. I'm going to throw a couple things at you and you can choose what you want to answer. So anything more on failure if you want to talk about that, you know, and perseverance. And then I want to ask you also, you know, one of the things that surprised me about Kurt personally was how formal he could be with colleagues. You know, there was a kind of, even with Steinman, I think, certainly with the people that he knew that were in our circle, Lee Stringer, Howard Zinn, there was this kind of respectful courtesy, but also formality. And you know, great warmth, great goodwill, but also a kind of formality that I guess I understood as a kind of respect for the craft and a respect for the kind of solitude and loneliness that's also something that they all experienced. But do you want to speak to this? I mean, this really for both of you, I think, but this question of, you know, the formality and the and his, you know, the way that he interacted with people.
Well, I never knew Kurt, so Suzanne has more of a sense of how he interacted with people. But she talks in the book about how, in fact, Kurt came out of the milieu, not of the 60s when he became famous, but the milieu of the 40s and the 50s. And there he was at GE in the period covered in my book. He's at GE and he's going to work every day in a suit and a fedora at 9 o'clock on the bus with all the other company men. And when he finally cut the tether and decided to break out and work for himself and write, he rented an office and he went to the office every day in the same exact way. He treated it very formally. He treated it as a job, and it was a job. I mean, he supported kids and a wife and bought a house, writing short stories for magazines, which is kind of amazing to contemplate today. And you know, that ties into the issue of failure and perseverance, because, You know, when you, the Vonnegut archive at the Lilly Library in Bloomington, Indiana, has draft after draft after draft after draft of stories, many of which failed, many of which never became good. And it's very instructive to look at them, and it's in a way inspiring to writers to see that someone who's, you know, one of the great prose stylists of the 20th century in America spent a long time trying to write kind of sappy stories for Redbook that didn't work out. I mean, he sat at that desk and produced draft after draft of stupid love stories for Redbook. And it's because he and Jane sat there looking at Redbook and thinking, what do they want? Let's give them what they want. He knew he was in the entertainment business, and he really shaped his work to try to sell it because he didn't have a choice. I mean, he wasn't very good as a car salesman. He wasn't very good as a teacher in a school for wayward boys. You know, he knew that really the only thing he was going to be able to do to make a living was write. So.
Suzanne, do you want to speak to, because you knew him well?
Yeah, a lot of things were going through my mind all at once. So your first question was how formal he was with other writers?
It's one of the, this is me being selfish here. You know, I spent a lot of time with Kurt over the years, and I was always struck, because it was foreign to me, but I understood it. He wasn't formal with me, you know, but I was much younger, so it was a kind of avuncular friendship. But I would see him with other writers, peers, you know, and there was a kind of this respectful formality, and I kind of liked it, and I wanted to understand it better. So that's why I'm asking, selfishly.
I have a lot of contradictory quotes in my book because he's a person. He said one thing one time and another thing another time. So he has contradictory things about colleagues. And one of them at the beginning is someone asks him in an interview, how do you feel about other writers? And he said, well, I can't remember the wonderful Vonnegut comparison, but it's something like we're in two different businesses. I'm in deep sea diving and they're in flying kites or something like that. He didn't say that. I'm making it sound like he's the better guy, and he didn't put it that way. Like I'm a dentist and they're whatever. But then there are other quotes in which he says that any writer is a colleague of mine. So he was very supportive of writers. At the workshop, I mean, I have a chapter that's called Breakthrough about writing Slaughterhouse-Five and about the community at Iowa. And the other day I was looking at letters from him in the 50s when he's all by himself out there trying to write, and he wrote a letter if there's to someone, to Knox Berger, his friend, if there's some community thing going out on there somewhere of artists, let me know about it. I want in on about it. He was lonely. He was terribly lonely. And that's one of the reasons he came to Iowa. He would say that. So there was a whole ready-made group of wild, intense male writers, no women, of course. And he was friends with them.
Yeah. I want to read something from Suzanne's book, which is a letter that... I want to read something from Suzanne's book, by the way. There's all these rejection letters that he got, which will, you know, I don't know how he could have survived so many of them. But there's a letter in here that I think will convey to you how much he cared, and what you know, he would have made a great publisher, actually, because he really wanted writers to write their best work, and he just wanted that in the world, you know. And he often pushed me when there was somebody we were publishing that he thought was great. He would send me faxes in the middle of the night. You know, for Lee Stringer, he did that. Dan, you've discovered the next Jack London. You know, when is it coming? You're all going to make $1 million, etc. But this is a letter that he wrote in '67 when he was at Iowa with Jose Donoso, and I'm just going to read one paragraph from this letter that's in facsimile in Suzanne's book. I will is a crude question. I will ask a crude question. Do you need an ending? If so, let's make one up immediately. As a crass favor to the man you used to be. Donoso had written to Kurt saying he was having suicidal thoughts and he was abandoning the book, which you know, The Obscene Bird of Night, which at that point was a 1,000-page manuscript, and he had written to Kurt saying he was abandoning it. And he'd been working on it for 10 years. Kurt at that point had been envisioning writing his war novel for 25 years. So he understood exactly where Jose was at. He said, do you need an ending? If so, let's make one up immediately. As a crass favor to the man you used to be, let us be his literary executors. Has he said enough in his 1,000 pages? Great God, to permit us to end in the middle of a sentence? You simply must have an outsider read what you have done. I don't trust your moods at all, except where friendship is concerned. I wish you had learned more about mental hygiene from Vance. If he had written 1,000 pages, he would have damn well divided those pages into 4 equal stacks and sold those stacks one by one to the literary guild. Nobody is writing any better than you are these days. Be not afraid. Great publisher. Was lost to the world when Kurt became a great writer. Well, I wanted you to comment on this aspect of Kurt. You've been talking about it a little bit, but this is the Kurt you had as a teacher who was so generous.
Well, I was looking for my generous passage. Let me find it.
Should I ask Ginger a question while you're looking?
Yeah.
We come back. Okay. Ginger, at the end of Brothers Vonnegut, you say something you say something about how misunderstood Kurt was as a writer of science fiction who was serious about science. You're talking about Cat's Cradle. And what you say, and I quote from the last chapter of your book, you say, one of the things critics rarely understand about Cat's Cradle is that it is not about the misuse of science. It's about the failure of people to understand the significance of a scientific advance. The threat in the book is not that scientists will produce something dangerous, but that the community won't recognize it when they do. So, do you stand by that still? And can you help us understand? You're saying it's not the scientists' fault that we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, so I think certainly Kurt was upset with the weaponization of science that happened during the Second World War and subsequently, and Bernard was as well. And Kurt had spent a lot of time at GE and hanging out with, going to cocktail parties with scientists, with his brother's friends, and he had great respect for science. So, it's not just a novel that's anti-science. It's pro-human. It's sort of saying, look, the scientists are doing things that are very important, but we need to remember that we're human, and we need to think about what the effects could be. And I think it's, it was very prescient, and it's the exact conversation that we're having today about technology.
I want to just say, Ginger and I had a really fascinating conversation about GE and scientists and so on. And I just want to make a plug for her book, because because it's a fantastic book about these two brothers who are both very creative, and we both use a passage in Player Piano for different effects because our books are for different purposes. But the quote is about the fork in the road when it's always clear where the good guys go one way and the bad guys go the other. And what your book captures is a lot of moral dilemma, and that Kurt talked to us about, and that he speaks about too, but moral dilemma about what happened to technology and the adoration after the war of what was going to happen, how we were going to all be liberated from everything. and the magic of science and etc. And your book really shows how that changed. I mean, the scientist, what's his name? How do you say his name?
Langmuir.
Yeah, he's the one that Kurt modeled Cat's Cradle on, and there's a priceless thing in Cat's Cradle about where the scientist leaves a tip for his wife after breakfast.
He was very absent-minded.
It was
Irving
it was
Langmuir.
based on this guy. He actually did that.
It was Bernie's boss. That was Bernie's boss, and a man who Kurt knew very well, and who actually gave Kurt the idea of Ice Nine. He
Yeah.
gave
Right.
him the idea for a science fiction novel.
So I'm being told we're almost out of time. I have one more quick question for each of you. So, Ginger, you write at the very end of your book that Kurt Vonnegut was a creation of Jane Vonnegut. And I know that's true, but can you explain it?
Sure. Kurt and Jane treated Kurt's career as a joint project. They went at it from the very beginning, working together. But going back even further, Kurt never really had the courage to think of himself as a writer in his 20s. He desperately wanted to write, but he kept telling Jane in letter after letter, and these letters are still in the hands of the Vonnegut family, in letter after letter, he said, look, I should be a lawyer, I should teach school, I should go work for the insurance company, I should do something, I could, because how am I going to be a writer? And Jane kept saying, no, you're going to be a writer. You're going to change the course of literature. At one point, he actually wrote back and said, this was when he was in the Army, so they were writing to each other. He said, you're terrifying me. I'm not going to change the course. What are you talking about? Are you going to stop loving me if I don't change the course of literature? And she wrote back and said, it's going to happen. She just had this amazing confidence, and that was a great foundation for him.
I have some problem with that. I mean, I think, yeah, she supported him, she encouraged him, all of that. He couldn't have possibly done it without her for many, many reasons. But okay. I mean, I just trust his own absolute inner seed. I believe this about people. I don't think that she couldn't have. I just.
Not to take anything away from
Yeah.
him. And you're right, I shouldn't have. It's just, but yeah. So, and my question for you is, tell people about In Darken Minh, because it's really an underlying
Okay.
kind of foundation of your book. And In Darken Minh, like, what the hell is that?
Okay, so I'm going to read this because it's too good not to read, because I'm not going to tell it very well. This is in the introduction, but it does. It's part of the whole vision of the book, and I loved it that when I told you about it when I first met you, you laughed and said, "Don't tell anybody; they'll steal it." So. For my part, I want to avert as much as possible my own and the reader's impulse to make dogma out of Kurt Vonnegut's advice. One way I hope to accomplish this is by adopting the concept of endarkenment. It's borrowed from Profound Simplicity by Will Schultz, published in 1979, the one book that gives meaning to the human potential movement, according to the cover. Schutz, a leading psychiatrist in that movement, lists his credentials early on. He explored everything, he'd done everything, he'd been at Esalen 10 million times, etc. And in my 30s, I was reading every single book I could get a hold of like that to help me because I needed a lot of help. The part that has stuck with me for over 40 years is his final chapter in Darkenment. It begins, sometimes my striving toward growth becomes the object of amusement to the part of me that is watching me. He tired occasionally of that striving and rebelled. So he devised a workshop called Endarkenment. In it, the participants were encouraged to be devious, superficial, and to wallow in their self-made misery. They drank hard, smoked like chimneys, stuffed themselves with junk food, and blamed everybody else for their problems, starting with the other workshop members all the way up to Almighty God. In teaching sessions, each person divulged their worst trait and explained how the others could acquire it. One man said he never finished things. He promised he'd teach the group how to do that the following Wednesday. When Wednesday came, he had dropped out of the workshop. The results of the endarkenment workshops were startling. They were as effective as regular workshops in raising people's awareness of the human comedy and in realizing that they themselves chose what they did and that therefore they could make other choices. I've adapted the word endarkenment and redefined it to use as a guiding principle. When alternatives, ironies, warnings about, or contradictions to previous advice or ideas pop up, the concept of endarkenment is at work. Parentheses. Originally, the word in bold marked those places, but these intrusions bit the dust in the editing process, thanks to my editor here. They were a little intrusive. You have to stop and figure out what I meant some of the time.
Did you ever talk to Kurt about endarkenment?
No.
No.
But the reason this is here, I mean, I started down below, but there's a Wilfred Sheed said of Vonnegut, he won't be trussed up by an ism, even a good one. He preferred to play his politics and even his pacifism by ear. Vonnegut was prone to seeing the other side of the coin, ambiguity and contradiction. I mean, he was a guy who was an American prisoner of war from a very predominantly German background, with a brother who was a scientist who was captured by, captured by the Germans, bombed by the Americans. How could you not have a sense of ambiguity after you went through that? Plus, he already had it. I mean, Edie said to me his very early writings, even when he was a kid, were full of irony and so on. So,
can I open it up to questions? Are there? Could anybody want to ask questions of Ginger and Suzanne?
Hi.
hi, Bob.
So we were classmates at Iowa, and we both had Kurt as a teacher. But one thing I think you talked about in credit for is his incredible support of other writers. And I wonder if you talk about that, particularly with Dick Yates, who had written wonderful novels and struggled all his life. And a lot of people had switched from Kurt to Dick when Dick came into the workshop. Instead of being hurt by that, Kurt just supported Dick in so many ways, crucial to his life and writing.
And you studied with Dick more than Kurt, yeah. But Bob Lehrman here, I have a little. When you read the book, you will find a wonderful anecdote about making a living. You want to tell that anecdote? Okay. But you know. Okay. You know more about that support of Yates than I do.
Well, I'm happy to say that, but it would have been easy. Richard Yates wrote a book, Revolutionary Road, which I think is a fantastic novel, and so did people at the workshop. He was in and out of psych wards. He was an alcoholic and a chain smoker with one lung. But from 8 to 12 every morning, he was totally sober and productive. Instead of being annoyed at Dick, if you'll look, you will see Kurt praised him in book after book, and whenever he could mention him. When Dick had trouble getting jobs, he would put in a good word for him when he was really influential.
He stayed with him in New York and destroyed the bathtub or something. He was a true alcoholic. He was really a mess.
But he was really helped by Kurt's generosity.
Yeah. And I think he was generous to all of those guys at the workshop were very, like the letter he wrote to Jose,
And to students.
Yeah.
He really felt it was his moral duty, no matter how bad a story was, to read it thoroughly, critique it as best he could, support the ones he thought were good, as opposed to, for example, Nelson Algren, who thought it was, took a lot of nerve.
Wait till you read my parts about the workshop
Oh, really? I will do that on the train back. He was really a warm, supportive person.
Yeah, he was. Everybody. He was the best teacher, and he was the only teacher. This is also in my book, who at the end of the 2 years suddenly called together a meeting for all of us, because he was concerned about how the hell we were going to support ourselves. Nobody else mentioned it. You're just there riding away, pie in the sky. He gets this together. It was not a class. It was he conjured it up. And, you know, he said outlandish things at the time, like, go get a job in advertising, which was, what? This was the 60s, you know. That's when you realized he had come from the Depression and from working at GM. I mean, you get a job, you get a job. That's, you know.
I think he felt, I mean, what I saw, indignation on behalf of other writers and how they were treated. And, you know, he really stood up for Algren, you know, and that's how we met, is, you know, around Algren. And there was a certain indignation that somebody as great as Algren could end up the way he ended up. So, you know, Kurt got mad on behalf of his, you know, the sense of collegiality he felt. Other question? Anybody else?
No, not yet. I'm formulating stuff.
Was it? Yep.
What's the next book? I'm sorry? What's the next book? Repeat the question.
The question was, what will be the next Kurt Vonnegut book to come out? I don't know. You know, I think that I think this is really the last. There won't be another book like this. This is the last major Vonnegut. I don't know how it's even possible that this book that is, you know, that Suzanne conjured up, which is by Suzanne McConnell and is also by Kurt Vonnegut, that won't happen again. There's, you know, there's a lot. I have a graphic novel that was done by one of the great graphic novel people that they sent to us. That was sketched out and unfinished, that we'll talk to the family about. That's an interesting project. I don't think there's going to be a lot more, you know, I would say, you know, if anything.
Somebody had a question.
Well, I was just thinking it's interesting, the craft of writing and how technology has taken away. Oh, sorry. I was just saying how it's interesting. You're talking about the craft of writing. Oh, the craft of writing and how technology is taking away some of that craft in a way, especially with the younger generation. So it's just interesting to hear what you're saying about Kurt Vonnegut and that mixing with, you know, trying to get out there in the work world and trying to still keep writing. How can young people still do that? That was kind of what my thought was from this. How can young people, you're a teacher, how do young people continue the craft of writing? You know, how do you see that connecting with Kurt Vonnegut?
I really do address that in the book. I don't know if I can answer your question, though. I mean, I think the point I make, the larger point, is that although Kurt was pumping out these short stories, I mean, he quit GE to write, but then he was writing stuff he didn't care about at all. And so he was writing, but he still wasn't writing what he wanted. So it's the same today. It's the same and different. He was making money through writing, but that's like making money through, I don't know what kind of writing right now. You know, it wasn't what he wanted to do. So in any case, there's always a struggle in terms of being able to do it. I don't know if that's answering your question.
When we did the complete stories a couple of years ago, Dave Eggers wrote the introduction, and what he said was that he spoke about this moral force, you know, really grappling with, you know, these kind of the great moral questions as Kurt did in the stories. And Dave Eggers was saying, people don't do that anymore. And he was kind of lamenting that. So and he was very, well, it's true in a way, and so. And he was very sensitive about saying this. He didn't want to be seen as criticizing contemporary story writing or anything like that. So he didn't want that paragraph reprinted when that introduction was excerpted, in different magazines and in foreign editions. He didn't want that included, not because he didn't mean it, but because it was, it's a sensitive topic. But there is a sense, as Ginger was saying, that maybe there's something in Kurt's writing, Eggers was suggesting, and and in many other writers, that's hard to find today.
Excuse me, I just think that's BS. I think it's BS. Say more. Okay. I think people are always grappling with things. I'm just reading a novel by Andre Debus. He's always grappling with these down and out moral questions. People are always grappling. Not everyone is, but many people are. Dave Eggers is grappling. What is he talking about?
Well, I think he's maybe talking about autofiction and a kind of, and some current trends. There's something to what he's saying. I don't think it's BS. But it's not a blanket statement. It's silly, to make it bigger than it is. But there's something to what he's saying, I would say. I don't think it's BS.
Maybe you're talking from the publishing perspective. I mean, if I think about the writers I know and what they're struggling to say, I think that's...
They're probably not getting published necessarily. So
well,
publishing phenomenon.
Wait a minute. Here's James McBride. Look out at the audience, at my friends here. Here's Richard Perry back there. He's struggling away. Here's all the people in my writing group. Here's Roberta. And there. Here's Belle. Here's Risa. They're all trying to say something. I just...
Yeah, nobody's saying otherwise.
Yeah. But what are you saying?
But I think...
then?
What was Dave Eggers saying in the introduction?
Yeah.
I think he was saying that there's a way in which there's something kind of honest and good and a little bit earnest and a little bit naive and innocent that's in those Vonnegut stories from the 50s. I mean, again, Kurt didn't really write so much stories at the end of his life. It's really, he wrote many, many stories, but really in the first period of his career. And Dave's kind of looking back wistfully and saying, I really don't want to speak for him, but it seems like he's looking back and he's saying, there's something in that innocence, if you would, maybe that is I'm not seeing around me today. And he was uncomfortable saying it, but he said it anyway.
I think that it comes out of it. If I remember correctly what Eggers said, it comes out of the sense that Kurt, when he was first writing, was writing for Collier's. He was writing for popular magazines that everybody read. And so he had to write kind of accessibly. He had to write stories, and even though his stories were often ripped from the headlines, right? They were very much about things that he saw going on in society that he wanted people to think a little harder about. And so he wrote about them in an accessible way that people would come across in Collier's next to an ad for, refrigerators. So
yeah, I think that's part of it. It's also the Great Depression generation. You have these people who had childhoods in the Great Depression, like all these guys of that age, and then there's a kind of hard-won, not optimism, but a hard-won kind of humanity that, now it's a little bit of an inversion, of that, where we come from a time of such plenty and the great middle-class society, and then we're kind of going in the other direction. But I think it's a little bit, there's something special about the Great Depression generation, which Kurt was part of also. Last word, and then you should sign some books.
Well, I would love to read this one part of what Kurt meant to me, really. So I will find it because it's a great way to end. It's in my chapter on him teaching, but where is that chapter? Here we go. Sorry. Okay. I was so amazed that Dan let me keep all my prose and memoir stuff. I thought they were all going to be cut. So this is this very personal kind of thing that I just put everything in, and then he left it.
Some things were cut.
Some things were cut. And I wanted to say, whenever I'm really mad at him, I invoke Vonnegut and I say, he would be really angry at you for this.
True.
I've been having trouble. This is the on Vonnegut in class. I'll read a couple of things. When we were your students, you let us work it out for ourselves, Gail Godwin once told him. Yet your being there for us did the trick. Trusting is a two-way street. All he did in those classes and conferences was to trust us. He trusted that we were working out our tapes at our own pace in our own ways. And what would come, or it wouldn't. I've been having trouble concluding this topic. Kurt Vonnegut taught me about so much more than writing. At a time when I sorely needed models to know that one could keep on trucking, one could even thrive, in spite of personal and societal traumas, he was there, a template, teaching and writing. What he taught was more important than writing. He led us to abhor war, to be compassionate toward our characters, to respect people, to question rigid constructs, to care deeply, to try to be decent, to laugh, to tell useful lies. He taught these things by his responses to people's stories, by his anecdotes, by his quiet remarks, by his treatment of us, by being himself. I sang gospel every few weeks at a friend's loft in Soho in the 80s with a loose group of superb singers. We sang a cappella. We riffed and harmonized. One night, someone suggested that one person hold a single note while the others kept harmonizing. It seemed like a boring, static part to take, so I didn't volunteer. But when my turn came, I discovered that holding one note, while all other voices were moving up and down and around, not only took a fierce focus, but felt physical, as though I were a ridgepole holding up the rest of a swaying tent, threatening to pull to one side and then the other. That's what Kurt Vonnegut was like to me, a singular, sustaining note.
Thank you all so much for coming. It is amazing being able to celebrate this amazing writer and also Vonnegut. So if you would like to have your book signed,